Well, maybe let's see some of this work, and I think we're going to explore chapter one, which is such a fundamental chapter. Exploring the origins of the universe and one kind of interpretation and story about that. Yeah, I mean, do you want to just go ahead? Is there anything you want to preface about maybe what this chapter is about and how people could think about it before jumping into it?
Yeah, well, maybe we could start by you. Maybe you can just say a little bit about your impression of chapter one. Is that a good idea?
Sure, of course, yeah.
Okay.
The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The Tao is both named and nameless. Yeah, it's one I've remembered. Both named and nameless. Named, it is the mother of myriad things. Nameless, it is the origin of all. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery itself. With desires, one can only see its manifestations. And to see the mystery is the doorway to all understanding. Yeah, I mean, that first line, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. I mean, what a way to start, a book called the Tao and the Way of Virtue, to just say, hands up, these aren't the answers here, but, hopefully the remaining chapters still have some value. And I think that's certainly, for me, it's just an appreciation of complexity and a reduction of dogmatic defense of truth. So yeah, certainly it's a chapter that I've found incredibly powerful. And maybe I can talk more about it as I understand yours. But yeah, very good choice.
I think what you mentioned there at the very beginning is a realization of the limits of language. So there's a little bit of irony that the book exists at all.
Yes.
But right now I'm working on the next volume in this series, which is about Zen Buddhism. And there's a story in there that you might be familiar with about a nun who goes to the sixth patriarch of Zen, Huineng, and asks him to explain a little bit of a sutra. And he says, "I'm sorry, but I'm illiterate. Could you read it out for me?" And she's aghast that this great scholar monk is illiterate. And she challenges him and said, "If you can't understand the words, how can you understand the meaning?" And he says, "Well, it's like a finger pointing at the moon. Words, the meaning is not in the words themselves. So you shouldn't mistake the words for the meaning, just like you shouldn't mistake your finger for the moon." And I think this is a good reminder as a person reads the Dao De Jing that the lines are not intended to be, as you say, dogmatic, but more like rules of thumb, things to help you, point you along the way and help you understand a very complex topic in a way that each person will approach differently. And so the insights that you get from it, George, will probably be different from the insights that I get from it. And the insights that I get from it today are probably different from the insights that I got 20 years ago. And I think in this way, when people say that the book is a poem, that's not quite correct. Because speaking in terms of just formal literary style, it's not a poem, but it is poetic, and it has that sense that when you read a poem, you get different things out of it over different times. It's suggestive as opposed to just discursively instructive.
Yes, and having that kind of embracing uncertainty rather than, being forceful with one's truth, kind of matches. I mean, postmodernism. It's not something, big word, but this kind of transition from this is how the world works and this is what a country is and these guys are bad, these guys are good, opening up a bit more into the uncertainty of both things being true at the same time, good and evil. And, that's chapter 2 of these judgments.
Mm-hmm. Right. And the one character that you translated as eternal is sometimes translated as constant, which is not a word we use all that much in English. But it has a slightly different meaning from eternal, where eternal is outside of time and always existing. The word constant points more towards a kind of rhythm of the universe, a kind of pattern that's there, but also changing. And so, whereas eternal sort of has an element of something that never changes, the idea of constant has the idea of something that is still there, but is sort of internally changing. So when you think of, when I think of Tao, I think of it as the processes of nature, which are always there in the background, but always changing as well. And so when you mention uncertainty, there's an uncertainty built into how nature works, but also there's a strange level of comfort also, knowing that there are rhythms to nature.
Yeah. So, I mean, that question of what is the Tao is kind of a cliche in Taoism. But I mean, so the kind of laws of nature, is that, you know, how you, I mean, you and Tsai have this beautiful exploration in the book for chapter 1. Have you got a copy there? Wow, fantastic.
Can you see it? Yeah. I printed it out just in case I need to refer to it.
I mean, maybe could you talk us through this, because this is a very interesting, so we've talked about the kind of poetic approach to chapter 1, which is kind of the original. Mm-hmm. And then the chapter you've done with Tsai is a dialogue. So maybe could you take us through that?
Sure. Would you like me to read it and then talk about it?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay. Chapter 1, the Ineffable Tao. So we covered the ineffability already. Right, you mentioned it's a dialogue. So one person says to another, the Tao is like this. It does this, and it isn't this. And the student says, oh, I get it. And then Lao Tzu comes along and says, excuse me, but I believe you are mistaken. If you can clearly explain the Tao, then that is not the Tao. So this is line 1. Which you covered already. The Tao encompasses, Lao Tzu says, the principles of all things. It is formless, silent, has no body, and is enduring. Enduring is that word I just mentioned that could be translated as constant or eternal. This idea cannot be clearly explained through language. So when he says it's formless, silent, has no body, this is not in the original, of course. The original is just a few characters. So this is one of the few places in the book where Tsai actually expands in the drawings itself on the ideas. Normally, he just translates it straight up. But I think here he felt like it's good right at the outset to lay the groundwork so that the reader can understand it and what's going on. On the next page, it continues. They begin asking Lao Tzu now, what do you call this great principle that encompasses all things? And Lao Tzu says, no, 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 it's impossible to give it a name. So that's the second line. Because if you call it A, then it's not B. You call it white, then it's not black. And here again, Tsai's elaborating a little bit to explain. Lao Tzu says, if you want to understand the Tao, you must forsake languages and names. You have to understand it through intuitive insight, or you'll get lost on the wrong path. As soon as you understand this, you can talk about the beginning of heaven, earth, and all things in between. And then the student starts to get excited and jumps up and down.
Yeah, that's great.
Lao Tzu goes on, in the beginning, there were no material bodies or even any shapes or forms. We call this state no-thingness, or nothingness. Nothingness is the underlying substance of the universe, the original source of the universe. Now the key term here in Chinese, as you know, is wu, which is hard to translate into English. It can be translated as simply nothing, but it obviously has a bit more pregnant meaning than that. So to translate it no-thingness gives a sense that there is an inchoateness or an unformedness of the world in the beginning. This seems to be an interpretation of the Dao De Jing, the first chapter of the Dao De Jing, as a kind of cosmogony, as a beginning of the universe, an explanation of where things came from. This is what philosophers have been asking all over the world for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Where is everything from? Why are we here?
Yes, yes.
And this is one way to explain that. I was listening to your explanation in the beginning, and it seemed a little bit different from this. And that's worth talking more about in a second. So let's continue here. When the Tao produced the function of creation, things came forth. This is what we call being. This being is the function of the Tao. So being is a key philosophical term in Western philosophy. It's interesting that the word in Chinese that's being translated as being really means just to contain. There is something in the universe, but there's no pointing at any being per se. This is one of the differences, an interesting difference between Western theory going back to the Greeks who are trying to find the essence of things, and Chinese philosophy where they're simply just saying have, meaning contain, meaning there's something around here, but we're not pointing at any particular thing. And this is, I think, one of the major differences between Chinese philosophy and Western philosophy. Western philosophy focuses on understanding the being itself, whereas Chinese philosophy is understand more the broader context.
Yes.
Continuing on. So when we understand that in the beginning there were no things, we can come to comprehend the subtlety and mystery of the Tao's substance. When we understand that the origin of the many and varied things of the world is being, we can come to comprehend the vastness and limitlessness of the Tao's functioning. Going on to the last page of the chapter. Nothing in being. One is the substance, the other is the function. You can say they both come from the Tao, they just have different names is all. They can both be called mysterious, even more mysterious than mysterious. Now this rendering, this interpretation that Tsai gives here is a traditional interpretation. And it's the kind of interpretation that I studied when I first studied the Dao De Jing. And it is, like I said, cosmological. One way to understand this chapter is explaining the beginning of the universe and where things come from. And is, in that sense, very metaphysical. But I noticed, and so notice in here that there's no mention of the word desire. Whereas in your rendition of chapter 1, you mentioned it, you mentioned desire and desirelessness. Yes. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, ever desireless, one can see the mystery itself. With desires, one can only see its manifestations. So
okay. Let's talk about that for a second, if you don't mind.
Please.
So having no desire means that you can see subtleties in the world. Having desire means that you can see the boundaries in the world. All right, so let me explain that a little bit. Think about what language does for us. Language allows us a purchase on the world. We can point at something and we say, that's a tree. We can say, that's a bird. It helps us capture things and manipulate things and communicate things and just live in the world. And what I think Lao Tzu is saying here is that desire does that for us as well, right? It motivates us to go out and act in the world. So there's something good about desire. It's not that all desire is bad.
Yes.
So Lao Tzu often talks about reducing desire as opposed to eliminating it altogether. An interesting thing about the Dao De Jing is that it's often said to be countercultural, right? That it is, there's a dominant view in society that you should struggle to the top and that you should get wealth and you should get fame and so on. You should be more masculine. And Lao Tzu comes along and says, no, you should be more feminine. You should be pliant and so on. Yeah. Now it's important to understand that I think that what Lao Tzu is saying here is that it's not you should be feminine exclusively and never be masculine. It's not that you should always be the opposite of what society is. I think what he's doing is providing a counterbalance. by emphasizing things that aren't normally emphasized. And when he talks about wu yu, about having few desires, he's talking about something similar.
Yes.
So desire has its good points. It motivates us to go out into the world and to live a life. But what are we forgetting when we concentrate only on desire? We're losing a lot of the subtleties of life, of our connections with the universe. So here he emphasizes reducing desire so that you can see those subtleties. So desire gives us boundaries in the world. We can grasp onto objects and we can make use of things. Reducing desires allows us to sort of meld in, to become one with our surroundings, and therefore to be more open and aware to the things that are next to us and around us, and that can help us feel more at home in the universe. This is one way of trying to understand chapter 1.
Yes, that's certainly something that resonates in my life, and that's very beautifully said. I mean, the desire to fix myself, is what brought me to the Dao De Jing. I felt something was out of balance, and so I had a desire to try and fix. And so then, I think that's a common theme of people coming to spiritual texts and learning through this desire. The more you learn, the more you see it in the world, and so in some ways, the more in it you can be. But then also that over desire, as you said, has that it goes too far. I have the example of going on a run. Back in the day, I'd be competitive and trying to get my personal best, have my Strava app on, and I would see nothing except I would see nothing. I would just have one foot in front of another. But now when I run, and maybe it's because I'm lazier than I used to be, is because
which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
I don't think it is. On my runs now, I see so much more, and I will stop when there's an insect, and I will stop and look at a tree, and much more is brought into the world because I haven't got this one fixation on one outcome, which then blinds me to the subtleties, which I think is a fantastic word. That is all around us, but because we have these desires, we've got the blinkers on and can't see.
Right. Yeah, going back to the line that you recited, can you recite that again? So desireless.
Ever desireless, one can see the mystery itself with desire.
Okay, stop right there. So the mystery itself sounds like there's one true truth to the world. Again, eternal, like there's some kind of God or consciousness behind all things. I think that's a little bit, in my view, a misunderstanding of what's being said here. I don't think one way, let's just say, instead of saying I think, one way of understanding the text is instead of seeing one thing that exists, again, being, this is kind of a Western or even Indian idea, Indo-European idea that there's a being behind all things in the universe. The Chinese idea seems to be more like there's a multiplicity behind all things in the universe, that instead of a cosmogony where the universe started at one point and then it unfolded to the point we are now, it's really an ongoing process of unfolding. And you can think about how things are created in the world. The tree grows up from a seed, it sprouts fruit, the fruit falls to the ground, it rots, it goes into the soil, and then it comes up again as another tree. This ongoing process where things are inchoate, unformed, and then they form and then they disintegrate. Again, this seems to be what I think what Lao Tzu is talking about here, an ongoing process. And if we can realize that and become more in tune with that, then we can live a fuller life.
Yes, that's interesting. And I wonder, because a question I was going to have is the compatibility of this kind of story of how the world works with science. Because on the one hand, there's the people that say that this chapter is quite in keeping with kind of the Big Bang theory, and it's kind of in contradiction to what you're saying. I like what you're saying because the chapter that I've recited has this origin, which implies a starting point, which is one interpretation, which is scientists like the Tao. The Tao can kind of sit around science because it doesn't claim so much that it can't include current scientific thinking. But then there's this kind of cyclical element as well, which is that there are no set start and end points in nature. That is just a kind of construct of our minds. So yeah, what's your thought on the compatibility with science and those two different interpretations?
Yeah, I don't think they're incompatible interpretations. I think you can see it both ways. And I think you're right that the Dao De Jing is not contradictory when it comes to contemporary science. I hesitate to look at ancient texts and say, oh, they obviously understood nuclear physics just like we do. I think that's going a bit too far. As long as there are insights to be had that we can apply today, I think that's the important thing. So when it comes to cycles, I think that is something we can take away from it. When I think of a cycle, I think visually of a circle going around, which in a way doesn't really lead anywhere. It doesn't show any progress, and it doesn't show a lot of differentiation. You end where you started.
Yes.
I think a different way to see a cycle is as like a sine curve, where it's going like this, where there are peaks and troughs. There's a saying in Chinese that you might have heard, 否极泰来. So when something very bad happens, there's something good happening coming around the corner.
Yes.
And then there's the opposite of that as well. And the idea is that you don't want to get too caught up in whatever is happening at the moment, because if you are indeed part of a cycle, then something is going to change down the road, and it's either going to get better if it's bad now, or it's going to get worse if it's good now. And to have that kind of distance from the current moment is important. So I think Taoism is very interesting that it allows you to enjoy the moment, it encourages you to enjoy the moment, but it also gives you a kind of distance from the moment. And both of these sort of work in concert to allow you to understand things and to live in the world in a way that is constructive and meaningful.
Could you expand on distance from the moment? What do you mean by that?
Right. So if you can get some perspective on what's happening at the moment, you don't feel too caught up in it. In other words, when he talks about desire, desire is how you get caught up in things. And by having fewer desires, you're able to distance yourself. You're not being led around by the nose, in a sense.
Yes, very interesting. And you talked about, the kind of, if the text can still be useful today. And, obviously it's got 81 chapters full of wisdom. In terms of this idea of the Tao, what would you see, in your own life, or what's the significance of understanding the world in this way that we've discussed?
Well, Taoism I think, is valuable in many ways to a contemporary life, because it does offer this kind of yin and yang of perspective and momentariness. So if you think of in Zhuangzi, there were the stories of the people who had a high level of skill, like the person cutting up the cow or the person catching cicadas, and they're obviously in the moment, right? They're totally focused on one particular thing. So when you're doing your Tai Chi, I'm thinking you're probably pretty focused on one particular thing. And there's something that's incredibly rewarding about that. In the moment, it's like you're not even there. So it's hard to say it's rewarding in the moment. But afterwards, you have this feeling like, wow, that was an incredible experience. And you can make certain achievements also when you're in that experience. So that kind of being able to focus on the moment is a valuable aspect of life. And it's impossible to do if we're constantly concerned about the future or regretful about the past. So this is what I mean about the momentariness. But we can't live like that all the time. There are concerns in life. There are things we have to get done. So by being able to take a step back and seeing how things are interconnected and seeing how patterns evolve, by seeing how things recur, and by seeing how things disintegrate, we can, I think, have a little bit more wisdom about how to live our life. day to day.
Very well said. Yeah, that's certainly, yeah, perspective in my kind of journey of trying to learn more about myself. And I personified my negative thinking as the underminer, which is a little evil wizard that, is the voice in my head that brings me down and gives me pain. And I look on it with more kindness now. One, because I feel like it's part of the Tao, and the Tao is so complex I can't control everything. So it's okay to have some bonkers thoughts come into my mind. But also, very well said. You know, in the moment, and also the perspective as well, which is that my underminer is scared right now of, worrying about the future, or I made a mistake in the past, and just taking that step back and having the Dao De Jing to help create that space has been, incredibly transformative, and certainly, for many people over centuries and centuries, which I guess is why it survived down the generations and was buried in that 3rd century BC tomb. I'm sure in the afterlife will have similar sort of issues, that, it still has significance for our lives today.